Hello and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the International Center for Sustainable Carbon. My name is Benedicta and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, sustainable-carbon.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration on the website. Please type any questions you have in the question box as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. The subject for today's webinar is the need for a balanced approach to ensure energy sustainability, presented by Dr. Andrew Minchner. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Benedicta. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today. I'm going to, as I said, talk about the balanced approach to ensure energy sustainability. And I'm going to be using some of the issues arising with the situation in the European Union because of the Russian-Ukraine war as a basis for a number of discussion points. Before I do that, I'm just going to give you a few words of who we are and what we do, building what Benedicta said. We are a technology collaboration program that's organized under the auspices of the IEA, but we're functionally and legally autonomous. As Benedicta said, we're funded by national governments and by corporate industrial organizations. And we provide independent information and analysis on how coal and other carbon-based materials can be cleaner sources of energy, compatible with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of the presentation, there are several factors that need to be considered when assessing the sustainability of different energy sources. And we believe they can best be represented by the use of the energy trilemma. And I'm going to talk about that and then delve into energy security considerations, as I said, with a focus on the global impacts that have arisen due to Russia's war against Ukraine. The point about all this is that is causing very significant changes to the global energy map that almost certainly will not be reversed in the near future. So having taken you through that, I will then reflect on whether the energy crisis is declining and what are the consequences for the participants. And that will lead into the key takeaways. And of course, I'll then be very happy to discuss with you any points that you wish to raise. This is a representation of the energy trilemma, and it's essentially a means of determining the relative importance of factors that impact on energy sustainability under various conditions. And there's really a need to balance all three factors to achieve a sustainable situation. That essentially means a compromise. So to achieve sustainable energy, you've got to be able to secure the energy that's needed for economic development. That energy's got to be affordable and available for all at all times. And its use needs to ensure that there is minimal adverse energy system impacts on climate, ecosystem, and human health. The need to balance all three factors is actually means you need to compromise. And in this particular instance, I think that's a very appropriate way to consider it. I think the other point to stress is that energy availability and accessibility are not equal worldwide. And the OECD countries generally have better access and more effective means to exploit such resources than can be achieved by developing countries in their regions of influence. And a further key issue, I think, is to recognise that while such OECD countries consume considerable energy resources, not all of them, in fact, have ready access to domestic supplies, making it necessary to depend on imports. And this is particularly the case within the EU, with the various nations purchasing natural gas, oil, and in some cases coal, the latter being used for power generation and associated industrial processes. I think the EU's approach to changing that is well known, with a wish to remove the use of fossil energy sources and to replace them with variable renewable energy. Whether that's a good thing, I would rather be very cautious about that, again, some of the points that are going to come up in my presentation shortly. And with that in mind, this is again another representation of the global energy consumption and supply. And the very dark brown areas are essentially the areas that have very adequate supplies of energy at primarily at competitive prices. So that very much applies to North America. It applies to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and most significant parts of the European Union, as well as the UK. But that does leave the very great majority of the country in a more impoverished position regarding its access to readily available and usable energy sources. Moving on, I want to now talk a little bit about energy security concerns and their realization. This slide is put together by the United States back in 2022 and is a reflection of the exported energy from Russia in 2021 and where that energy went from a Russian perspective. So you can see here, for example, that if you're talking about crude oil, 49% of Russia's exports went to the European Union, and the next largest chunk went to Asia. If you look at the supply of natural gas as exports from Russia, you can see that 74% of that natural gas ended up in Europe, in the EU, with tiny amounts going to Asia and the rest of the world. As far as coal is concerned, 32% of the coal that was produced in Russia ended up in the EU, but the majority of the coal ended up in Asia. And that again is a reflection which we'll come back to, that the use and need for coal is very much increasingly focused on developing countries because of the political decisions being taken by the likes of the European Commission and the US Department of Energy. That last slide, where you can see all of very large proportions of the energy needs of Europe being supplied by one supplier, does raise energy security concerns. And it rather puts the European Union in a weak strategic position to be dependent in that way, or to have been dependent in that way on Russian energy exports. That said, of course, from a Russian perspective, the EU energy purchases were very significant, and they provided a very significant financial contribution to Russia's war effort. In fact, the cost prior to the breakdown in supply and the war starting between Russia and Ukraine, the European Union was paying $850 million a day for gas and oil supplies, plus a seemingly paltry $20 million a day for coal. And as I said, that puts the EU energy security at considerable risk, not least because Russia has a previous record of weaponizing its energy exports to get the recipient to follow certain political routes. It was therefore rather surprising that Germany in particular had been seeking even stronger gas supply links with Russia. Already having a major gas supply known as Nord Stream 1, they were in the process of cooperating with Russia to build a second stream known as Nord Stream 2. In fact, it was only cancelled just as the final construction was underway, when it became evident that Russia was likely to be cutting supplies to the EU. And in fact, the important point about this is not just that Russia could cut off supplies, it's the fact that replacing such large quantities would not be easy, since these sources were going to be needed at a time of global rising demand and prices. not least because the economies were at that point recovering from the impact of COVID. Just as a small aside, I think it's worthwhile we remind ourselves that methods of energy transport also have a profound effect on supply options. Now, for example, as shown in this slide, gas can be transported in several ways. They can be delivered via pipelines. Natural gas can be delivered by pipelines, but for longer distance transport, natural gas can be liquefied and then transported by either pipeline or by ship. So we have an example of the types of ships that are used, and we have an example of the types of pipelines. Very significant infrastructures. By comparison, if one's interested in transporting coal, if it's on a continent, it can be taken readily by rail, shown on the right-hand side of the slide, or by a very simplistic tanker-type ship. It can be moved around pretty much anywhere. Moving on to the global impacts of Russia's war with Ukraine, there was understandable and quite rightly outrage at Russia's blatant and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, and that rapidly led to a wide range of OECD sanctions being applied to counter Russian aggression. The intention was to shut down Russia's economic options such that it couldn't maintain a war. And this included ceasing to accept Russian exports of all kinds. Now, given that the EU was paying close to $900 million per day and rising as inflation soared, this was a major potential impact on the situation in the EU. And being so dependent on Russian energy, while stopping these supplies would undoubtedly hurt Russia's ability to fund its war effort, but equally importantly, the EU had to secure alternative supplies, because as without those adequate replacements, if Russia turned the supplies off, that would just lead the situation of the EU into a very dangerous recession. So it was a tricky and difficult situation. I think the other point just to stress is that once the EU had to essentially find an alternative for all its gas, oil and coal, that had an amazingly large impact on global demand for energy imports, and it had a massive knock-on and adverse effect on commodity prices, and that pushed up inflation again still further. So with that in mind, did the EU fight back? Yes, it did. Russian coal imports were sanctioned by late summer of 22. Russian oil imports were delivered by sea were sanctioned by the end of 2022, but there's still some pipeline supplies continued to a limited number of EU countries. Probably fair to say that they're countries that are not as adverse to Russia's approach to things as the other countries within the EU. That's just a possible coincidence. And of course, Russia itself then closed down supplies of gas to the EU in late September of 2022. The EU has had a major program sourcing alternative oil supplies, alternative gas. The latter was primarily for natural gas via Norwegian pipelines, and then as liquid natural gas, again from Norwegian suppliers, but also various suppliers worldwide, including the USA. Again, demand has been high, prices have had to match that. There was a scope for using more coal to reduce the need for gas, and some countries did do that, but this is not favoured by the European Commission on environmental grounds. So I personally found that as a strange situation when the danger of the whole of Europe being limited in terms of the energy that it could be supplied with. But with that in mind, that would obviously start creating changes in the global energy map. And the Russian invasion wasn't the start of the problems, as I said, but certainly it seems that cutting through this slide very quickly, many of these market distortions that we're starting to see will likely represent permanent changes to the previously nominally balanced EU-centric market that was primarily supplied by Russia. It seems impossible to imagine a situation where Russia comes back to be a supplier of choice to the EU in the future. The other point I want to stress, and it's important in terms of what follows here, is that what I've mentioned that OECD countries have sanctioned Russia. In fact, only OECD countries have sanctioned Russia. As shown here, that's the green parts on this particular schematic. So in contrast, while the OECD countries have been leading this fight back against Russia in various ways, in contrast, the developing nations have stayed out of this economic battle, but in certain cases, in fact, notably India and China, they have proactively taken the opportunity to improve their trading prospects by purchasing Russian fossil energy supplies at depressed prices. They held the upper hand in the negotiations. So who's going to benefit in overall terms from this problem, which Europe is resolving as well as it can? Well, it's going to be Russia. It's going to be Asia. Now, to put this in context, Asia is home to over 50% of the global population, but has access to only about 40% of its own energy needs. And all but 3 of the countries in this block are classed as developing nations. They have growing energy needs as they seek to build their economies. As I mentioned earlier, the 2 dominant nations here are India and China. India is the 3rd largest energy consuming nation in the world, with a rapidly rising energy use that has doubled since the year 2000, of which 80% is met by coal, oil and solid biomass. But there is also an increasing input of variable renewable energy. China, which has the 2nd largest economy worldwide, it dominates the global energy mix and has a bilateral cooperation agreement with Russia. It's the largest oil importer in the world. It seeks gas import opportunities and it also buys coal or discounted coal from Russia, both for power and coking applications. I think the other point to stress is, as well as building links with China and India, Russia is also seeking some form of economic union with the Central Asian republics, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Again, because it's seeking new markets for gas that Europe now shuns because of the war situation. As I said, the 2 major energy using giants are India and China. And I'm not going to go through this detail now. You can have access to the presentation as Benedict has indicated. But you can just see with the numbers there are massive quantities of oil and gas in particular being bought up, and in China's case also considerable amounts of coal. And that is going to have global implications as we move forward. Just again, as I said, India and China are the major buyers of Russian oil and gas, and this shows the build-up of supplies of oil imports by India and China. You see, China is already quite well established in this particular area, but you can look at here at the massive, rapidly rising take-up of oil imports by India from Russia. Very, very significant. The other thing that's changing is the gas pipelines from Russia. There was a significant number of gas pipelines that went west into Europe. These are doesn't look like they're going to be used again. But we're also seeing now starting to see pipelines going east into northern China, as sort of indicated here. And I think this sends, I think, a number of clear signals. It suggests that Russia does not expect in any way to regain market share with the EU. I think that's a fair assumption. So it's now trying to establish, in fact, 2 pipelines to supply northeastern China and beyond. And that's essentially, there's the Power of Siberia pipeline. That's an existing pipeline that's not quite fully operational yet. But when it is, it's going to deliver 38 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia to China. And there are agreed plans to build a second line, the Power of Siberia 2, which is expected to be operational by 2030 and will have a capacity similar to the gas supplies that were previously sent to the EU. So that really does suggest that market link between Russia and China has very much gone. This is probably a bit of tittle-tattle, but it may not be. In 2022, China declared that in the first 6 months of the year, it bought 2.35 million tons of LNG from Russia. But due to COVID still being active in China, there was a fairly subdued home demand for that gas. And it looks like it's been sold on and sold on and sold on, and some of it now is being quietly resold. What was Russian LNG is now being quietly resold to the EU at a very significant markup. The other question now is that we've had a fairly fraught year. The EU managed to achieve almost the impossible by replacing all of that Russian energy with alternative supplies, and has got through the winter just about, though at least in Europe it has been remarkably mild for this particular year, but hey, take the good luck when you get it. So, you know, the gas price is not a great deal different to what it was before this interactions broke out because of the war against Ukraine. So does that mean the crisis is now declining? I think the answer to that is yes, it is to an extent, but it's still very hard to judge what's going to happen in certainly next year or the rest of this year and the beginning of the year after that. So you can say it is declining, but there are consequences arising, and some things have definitely changed. So there are energy consequences that we need to think about. The EU sees variable renewable energy plus energy efficiency as their way forward to achieving carbon net zero by 2050. They also see it as a way to ensure unit energy security because the components for those things can be built, manufactured within Europe, so doesn't have a need for importation. Though it does have a need for importation of some of the rare earth elements that are going to be necessary for the control systems on some of the wind turbines, for example. So their view of it sees a way to ensure energy security isn't necessarily shared by other regions, or at least those regions that are supplying some of the specialist components. I think in contrast to that, coal will continue to be a key energy driver of Asia, and China will see its influence in this massive region significantly strengthened. It's seen as the leading player for the likely introduction of CCUS as well, once the major commercial scale demonstration projects are completed in China. So I think also perhaps the final point on this is although energy prices are not rising so quickly and in fact seem to be compatible where they were a couple of years ago, it's still not clear whether that happy situation is going to continue, and certainly it's not at all clear whether that war between Ukraine and Russia will in any way be declared over. In fact, it seems very difficult to see how you can reach an acceptable endpoint in the current situation. Are there some non-energy consequences within Europe? Yes, I think there are. Most importantly is the importance of NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that's one of its key requirements is to link the USA and Canada to its European the European countries to provide protection and support in the event of aggression against Europe by primarily Russia. In the recent years, there's been a lot of question marks raised by certain EU countries that do we really need NATO, and most importantly from their point of view, do we really need to pay these annual subscriptions to remain a member of NATO? Well, I think that question's been answered because NATO has been at the forefront of all the interactions in support of the Ukraine, to the extent that two European neutral countries, Finland and Sweden, have now changed their stance there and are seeking to join the NATO alliance. And there's also some evidence that is perhaps the local locus of power shifting east, away from the traditional policymakers such as France and Germany. We're certainly seeing Poland, for example, taking a much stronger position on various issues than it did in the past. So, moving on to my key takeaways. I think the need for resilience in a nation's energy system to ensure security of supply at acceptable costs and with comprehensive environmental standards is a clear aspiration, should be a clear aspiration, but is not always met. And I think it's also when security of supply is threatened, it is essential that such threats must be countered, even when other aspects of the energy trilemma by necessity may need to be relaxed. And I think beyond that, given that most OECD countries have already fixated on variable renewable energy approach, it would appear, if you're in a developing nation and are not convinced by the variable renewable energy approach, that any take-up of a more technology-agnostic approach over the medium to longer term, with coal continuing to be a driver in the Asian region, that's going to be an interesting to see how that develops. Because I think again with Asia, there's interest in carbon capture, utilization, and storage as a way of targeting low carbon technologies as a way towards carbon neutrality. In conclusion, in that regard, energy security as part of the overall energy trilemma needs to be considered seriously. And seeking to balance all aspects of that trilemma can be difficult. I think it's fair to say there's no one-size-fits-all way forward, and what might look promising for, say, an OECD country in the EU with an advanced economy may not be appropriate for, say, a developing country in Asia. I'm going to beg your indulgence, and just before finishing, I just want to put up an advert for our next workshop, which you may find of interest. We, as an organisation, are running a series of workshops looking at the energy transition in different countries and how they are, adjusted, with the countries being different in makeup and stage of development, and how they are adjusting to put together and implement viable plans to take forward the energy transition in their particular countries. We ran a very interesting event the end of last year in Italy, and on this occasion, in 19th and 20th of April, we are running a second one, which is looking at the future of coal in a transitioning energy landscape in South Africa, with the support of our member Eskom, a long-standing member of the centre. So it's a very interesting program that can be put together. You can find information about this on our website, and we'll be happy, and Benedicte, who's heard at the beginning of this presentation, will also be delighted to help you with any queries you have. We hope some of you can perhaps join us at that meeting, preferably face-to-face, but we obviously understand the situation, and so virtual attendance would also be available. Please think about that, and if you can join us, you'll be very welcome. And with that, thank you very much for your attention and for listening. I hope you're listening. And I'd be delighted to have given this presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you the rest of a good day. Thank you. Back to you, Benedicte.
Yeah, there seems to be one question here.
Okay.
Where do you see this going?
Right. That's a short question, which could require quite a big answer. I think there's two parts to this, thinking about it. If you mean the questioner is wanting to know where, how the war between Ukraine and the Russian aggression that's been trying to take over all parts of Ukraine, how that might finish, it seems very, very difficult to judge. In the same way that the EU has managed to sustain its operations and by getting in energy from different places, Russia has managed to sustain at least a certain level of income by selling its energy resources, fossil energy resources, to countries in the east rather than countries in the west. And I think that will mean that Russia, to some degree, is weakened, and certainly that will have an impact. But whether it's going to be enough, or when it would be enough to stop the war, is very hard to judge. If you think about it from the point of view of how our energy resource is going to change in the future, I think, okay, as an organisation, we have some difficulties with the variable renewable energy approach, and if in doubt, put another field of variable renewable energy, solar panels in place or wind turbines in place. We're not convinced that that's necessarily the right way to go. We equally understand that people don't necessarily see fossil energies sources as quite the way to go. But there again, there are, because they say, oh, well, it's vulnerable. Well, I think the sort of incidents we've had with Ukraine and the European Union are pretty unique, and I think that having seen one, there are templates there for how one would address further ones. I don't know if that helps to answer the question, but that's my first thoughts for it anyway.
Yeah, there's another one here.
Thank you.
The coal market is increasing with new China capacity exceeding reduction elsewhere. Analysis indicates that the increase will mean 1.5 degree scenario cannot be achieved. What is your perspective on this?
It's my perspective is China has a long and perhaps unhealthy obsession with coal to some degree, but it sees coal as a bedrock of its operations. But I think also you can think of it in terms of, you have to remember that as well as China being the massive, continues to be a massive user of coal, is a massive introducer of variable renewable energy systems, solar panels, wind turbines, and so on. And a lot of those coal plants are not going to be operating at base load. They will be operating at peak load in the summer, mostly to drive air conditioners. As I indicated in my presentation, I think it's not just China, though China is clearly the largest, but there is quite a different approach between OECD countries and developing countries and how they might go forward. And it's not China is not the only one with using significant amounts of coal. CCUS is a way that you can get down to a low carbon coal-fired unit, not zero carbon, but a low coal-fired unit. And those systems, China is now the lead country for that, and so that's going to bring down the carbon levels considerably. I think it's something that's going to, the short answer to finish that question, I think it's something that's going to continue to evolve. I think also that the OECD countries and the OEDC organizations have to recognize that the developing countries do not have the same approach to them. They're not so convinced by variable renewable energy. And on that, they're perhaps not the only people who are not so convinced on variable renewable energy. Again, I hope that answers. If you want to write to me and take this discussion further, I'll be very happy to do so.
Yeah, there's another one here. You already, you've already touched on this, but this situation could prompt a faster transition to net zero and a major reduction in fossil fuels in Europe. Is there any indication that this is happening?
Within Europe, not greatly. I mean, yes, there's Europe has almost pushed out coal as a fuel, as the highest carbon fuel source. But it's replaced a lot of it with gas, which is then seen as a transitional fuel. Whether that gets you to the net zero point by the time that you want to achieve it is not clear at this point at the moment. And I think there's been some very interesting studies done at University College in London, which has been looking at the approach of OECD countries and how they're going forward, with the expectation that the whole world has to go forward at the same speed. And there's some very good arguments being put forward from UCL that in fact that isn't going to be the way it needs to be done. If anything, the OECD countries have got to move much quicker than they had, because they've got to take the lead rather than developing countries. It seems inappropriate for the developing countries to take the lead in reducing their carbon emissions in those sort of circumstances. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andrew. I think that's
You're welcome.
We have.
If anyone has any questions beyond when they think about them, just send them in and we'll get a reply to you.
Yeah. And all that's left for me to say is the slides from this webinar will be available to download from the webinar shortly from our webinar page. And the next webinar from us will be on the 26th of April on energy security in Europe following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and will be presented by Dr. Stephen Mills. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.